Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. And someone will say his career can never be saved. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage.
Welcome to Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly walk my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography, and today I'm talking about the 2010 dark comedy action film, KickAss. In KickAss, Nick Cage plays a masked vigilante who fights crime alongside his daughter in the aim to take down a mob boss played by Mark Strong. The two of them get wind of a teenage comic book nerd who decided to become a superhero called KickAss, and KickAss routinely gets his ass kicked and also becomes targeted by Mark Strong. And fun vigilante violence ensues. I think that film's about a hapless wannabe vigilante that doesn't have any powers and fails a lot is almost its own subgenre of movie at this point. Early on, these stories were mainly played for laughs with movies like Hero at Large, Blank Man, and Mystery Men. I guess some of those mystery men had powers, but I still think it falls into that category. But then we got a more darkly comedic character study approach to the subgenre in 2006 with the Michael Rappaport movie Special about a crazy guy who thinks he's a superhero. Then between 2009 and 2011, there were 3 films released about a misfit or a loser that gets into crime fighting and they get their ass kicked a lot. We had Defender with Woody Harrelson, which was pretty decent. I really like the movie Super. It's James Gunn's take on the subgenre, and it's really quirky and funny and poignant. I recommend it. But sandwiched between those films was a little movie called KickAss. Now, KickAss is based on a comic of the same name by Mark Millar. The rights to a film adaptation were sold before the first issue was even published, and the movie was written at the same time as the comic as a collaborative process. Apparently, director Matthew Vaughn had a hard time trying to get a distributor and financial backing for the film, because studios kept asking him to tone down the violence, and some studio executives even asked that they make Hit Girl a teenager. Thankfully they didn't change Hit Girl's age, but I do think the movie is slightly less graphic than the comic. There are some brutal parts in the movie that weren't in the comic, but the comic also had stuff like Hit Girl chopping a guy's head in half and you see his exposed brain, or this guy who gets shot in the dick and you see the severed tip of his penis. We don't quite get that in the movie, but after the film was made there was backlash to the violence and some of the subject matter. Even Roger Ebert wrote a scathing review of the film, where he worried about the effect the movie would have on the children of America, but I think he was clutching his pearls a little bit in this situation. I mean, it is shocking to see a young girl committing acts of violence, but I don't think it was gratuitous, and to me it all served the story. There were a couple of times in the movie where I did feel a bit bad for the bad guys, like this woman banging on the door trying to escape but she gets impaled by Hit Girl. But she was in cahoots with these hoodlums and brandished a broken bottle at Hit Girl. But there's also a part where Hit Girl and Big Daddy question a criminal for information, and once he's given them all the information he can, they crush him to death in a big car crusher machine. Giving somebody that's been compliant with you and is currently indisposed such a brutal death is highly immoral behavior regardless if the guy is a criminal or not. That's the only part of the movie to me that left a little bit of a bad taste in terms of the violence. But I think that uncomfortable feeling in that scene is an important part of the film, because it fits with the whole subversion of the comic tropes. You know, as far as I remember, I don't think Batman ever put a guy in a car crusher. And also it adds to the whole ambiguous morality of Big Daddy and Hit Girl. So I've read the comic book twice now, and I've seen the film 3 times. And by the way, heads up for big spoilers for the comic and the movie. But I would say in general, the film is mostly quite faithful to the comic. The story is largely the same with some notable exceptions. They both have the same central theme about the ramifications of a regular-ass guy attempting to be a vigilante. Early in the comic, KickAss says, "This isn't what I had in mind when I first put on the mask. The reality of the situation. This is what happens when you mess with bad people." And in the movie, a character says, "If anyone tried being a superhero in real life, they'd get their ass kicked." And both stories certainly show the main character getting their ass kicked. And even though a lot of the dialogue in the movie is different from the comic, there are some occasions where the lines are almost word for word the same.
That's not me, by the way. That's some Armenian guy with a history of mental health problems.
And some of the panels are directly recreated too. And there's even a part in the movie that pays direct homage to the comic book's art style, with that portion being contributed by the illustrator of the comic himself, John Romita Jr., which is a nice touch, I think, and I love seeing Nicolas Cage's face in the comic book style. But there are various changes in the film adaptation in terms of tone and character personality, and there's also 2 of what I consider major changes. One I think was for the better, and one I think was a downgrade, but I'll talk about them later. Right now I want to touch upon some of the smaller differences. I said earlier that the comic has more gore than the movie, but if we're comparing the action in the movie to the comic, I've got to give it to the movie. Not just because it's a visual medium, it's that all the fight scenes are handled extremely well in the film. You know, if you're lucky with an action movie, you usually get a couple of good, memorable fight scenes or set pieces. But this movie has about 5 of them, a few of which weren't even in the comic, like the warehouse fight with Big Daddy. I distinctly remember back when I saw this movie in 2010, thinking that warehouse fight scene was one of the greatest action scenes I'd ever witnessed in cinema history. 15 years later, I can't quite go that far. Partly because I think it's a bit of a cop-out that narratively we're watching nanny cam footage, but the camera's moving around and there's all these cuts. But sure, I can suspend my disbelief that this is a stylized rendition of what they're seeing. But I also think the camera work is a little bit too frenetic here for my liking in the scene. But it is an awesome scene nonetheless. It's Nicolas Cage basically dressed as Batman shooting the shit out of a room full of goons. It's badass. And I do like the way he awkwardly hobbles up the stairs here. Another badass part in the movie that wasn't in the comic was the part where Hit Girl rescues KickAss when he's being tortured. In the comic, Hit Girl shows up and quickly takes out the guys with her sword and it's over. But in the movie, we get this really impressive sequence that utilizes light and dark so well, with the fight just being illuminated by the gun flash. It's probably obnoxious to watch out of context on YouTube like this, but trust me, it's cool in the movie. There's also a night vision POV shot that plays out like something out of Call of Duty, which is another thing that blew my 17-year-old mind. And there's this part with the strobe flash on the gun, and again, it's probably annoying and epilepsy-inducing to watch it on your phone, but again, it's badass in the context of the scene. And that is something interesting because the movie does frequently use camera and editing techniques that I don't generally like in fight scenes. There's a lot of quick cuts, but they're stylized quick cuts, and I think they serve to show KickAss's erratic fighting style. And also the editing syncs up quite well to the music. And there are a lot of needle drops in this movie, which, having seen the Kingsman movies, I think the director Matthew Vaughn is quite fond of using a recognizable song to score an action sequence. Here we've got Joan Jett's Bad Reputation, there's a couple of songs by The Prodigy, a song from the Few Dollars More soundtrack, the Banana Splits theme, and the theme from 28 Days Later, which was composed by John Murphy, who also does the original score to Kick-Ass. And they're all great musical accompaniments to the action scenes. But I will say that some of those songs take me out of the film a little bit, because I already associate those songs with other movies like 28 Days Later and For a Few Dollars More. And truth be told, I don't think I can watch a fight scene that has Bad Reputation in it without thinking of Shrek 1. But that's just a minor nitpick. The final fight plays out quite differently in the comic than it does in the movie. In the climax of the comic, Hit Girl huffs a chemical compound implied to be cocaine or some sort of amphetamine. I would have liked if that was in the movie, but maybe they couldn't get away with showing a little girl doing drugs on screen. In the comic, Hit Girl uses a flamethrower at the end, and the movie swapped that for a rocket launcher and a jetpack with miniguns attached. They're both pretty awesome, although I do think that the jetpack stretches the realism that the movie was trying to go for a little bit. The whole gimmick of the movie is that it's a real-world take on a typical comic book story, but ironically, this part is more comic booky than anything in the actual comic book that it's based on. But also, at that part in the movie, you're having so much fun that you're like, a jetpack, sure, why not? But I also have a problem with the rocket launcher kill.
Hey, why don't you pick on someone your own size?
Come on, didn't you learn anything from Nicolas Cage? If you're gonna kill a guy with a rocket, you've got to make an awkward quip about Elton John first. So in terms of the dialogue, I think the quality of writing in the comic and the movie is a bit of a mixed bag. There's quite a funny recurring gag in the comic that they cut out from the movie, where Kick-Ass's friends make up the word tunk, which means cock and balls. It's a bit like the stop making fetch happen thing from Mean Girls. But the payoff here is that at the end a goon gets shot in the cock and balls and goes, "Ah, you shot me in the tunk." I thought that was pretty funny. And there's also several funny moments in the movie that aren't in the comic, most of which involve Nicolas Cage. But there's also a lot of what I consider teenager humor in the movie.
Sure, a lot of what got me through the average school day was making deposits in the whack-off warehouse for later.
Does it not bug you? Like, thousands of people want to be Paris Hilton and nobody wants to be Spider-Man.
Yeah, what's with that? She has, like, no tits at all.
I know this is how teenagers talk, and I remember getting a kick out of those parts the first time I saw the film when I was 17. But now I'm 32, and I think that lines about the whack-off warehouse and Paris Hilton not having any tits are, to put it bluntly, kind of beneath me. And a lot of the movie does kind of feel like it's aimed at 17-year-olds, which I don't have a problem with, it's just that I grew up a bit since I last watched it. There's also some pretty edgelordish dialogue in the comic that they cut from the movie, like Red Mist saying, "I've wanted to see you in pain since the night we met, I've even jerked off thinking about it." I'm glad we were spared the image of McLovin saying that in the movie. There's a few pop culture references in the comic that they cut out, like this line, "I like Scrubs, Stereophonics, the Goo Goo Dolls, Entourage, Snow Patrol, and Heroes." That's the whitest and most mid-2000 sentence I've ever read. But there is a comforting nostalgia to that kind of dated stuff. When I read that line, I was like, oh yeah, remember when we all liked the show Heroes until season 2 happened? And there's also this part where this gangster is said to be playing Spyro. For some reason, I got a real kick out of the the idea of a tough drug-dealing, woman-abusing gangster playing a PS1 game about a little purple dragon running around. But sadly, they changed it to what I think is Call of Duty in the movie. And actually, both the comic and the movie tap into that late 2000s nostalgia by reminding you that MySpace used to exist, and that YouTube used to look like this, and phones used to record videos that look like shit. Also, remember when people used to say something owns?
That guy's gonna end up dead, that's what I think.
Are you serious? The guy owns.
They actually even point that out in the sequel.
This evil lair owns!
Do people still say that? Oh?
Yeah, of course.
But there are some things in the comic that I'm not so nostalgic for. Like the liberal use of the bad F word that rhymes with flag, and the general homophobia in the story. Like, look at KickAss's first fight in the comic. He sees 3 guys graffitiing a wall, and KickAss responds by calling them homos for no reason. And then unprompted, he whacks one guy with a baseball bat. This is our hero of the story? That's enough to get you cancelled nowadays. I don't really have that big of a problem with that kind of stuff in a fictional piece of work. And again, I know that that's kind of how high school kids talked back in the late 2000s. But I just think it's poorly handled and a little bit jarring to read in 2025. And they took the awkward homophobia out of the movie. Well, most of it.
Oh, dude, that is one gay-looking taser.
Although it seems like in the sequel she learned her lesson.
All the homophobic shit makes it sound super gay.
And on the topic of gay stuff, that actually brings me on to one of the major differences between the comic and the movie. And that's the resolution to the storyline about KickAss pretending to be gay to spend time with Katie. The subplots start off very similarly in both pieces of work, where because Dave was found naked in the street, a rumor starts spreading that he's gay. His crush Katie starts spending time with him because she always wanted a gay BFF, and KickAss is more than happy to be close to her. In the comic, he presses his 7-inch boner into the girl's shoulder, after lying to her about being worried about coming out to his dad. And in the movie, she lets him apply tanner to her naked body. But then the subplots veer into 2 very different directions. In the comic, he tells Katie that he lied to her about being gay. She's disgusted and gets her boyfriend to beat him up. Then he goes home and sees his dad having sex on the couch. He opens his phone to receive a photo of Katie sucking her boyfriend's dick, and he proceeds to masturbate to the photo while crying, and the book ends. Quite the bleak ending, right? But in the movie, when he tells her he's not gay, it turns out she's completely okay with the knowledge that she's been lied to and manipulated. And not only that, but they have sex and start dating, which I think is a bit of a cop-out if you ask me. For a movie about realistic repercussions and subversions of tropes that you only see in fiction, it's kind of frustrating that they don't play around with this trope. And instead, the movie goes for the most cliche, unrealistic resolution to the storyline possible. Because 9 times out of 10, if you lie to a girl about being gay, she would be repulsed and you'd end up sad and on your own like in the comic. From what I read, I think I'm in the minority and a lot of people prefer the movie's ending. And even the writer of the KickAss comics, Mark Miller, stated that a film audience would have difficulty accepting Dave and Katie not being together. And maybe he's right. The comic's ending is a hell of a downer way to leave the story, whereas the movie closes on an optimistic note. And the last we see of KickAss in the movie is him kissing his girlfriend. I think at the end of the day, most moviegoers would rather see that than see a teenager crying while masturbating. To quote a line from the comic, what works on the page doesn't always work on the screen. I think it just comes down to whether you prefer something cynical and subversive, or something that brings more conventional gratification. So let's talk about the cast and the characters. And even though I'm dying to talk about Nicolas Cage, let's start with the titular character, KickAss. You know, after I rewatched Special and Super and Defendor, I really realized how normal Dave Lazowski, aka KickAss, is as a character. The protagonists in the other movies I mentioned all clearly have some sort of mental illness, but KickAss is just kind of a regular-ass relatable dude, which I think really works here. It actually sets it apart from those other movies, and I think it makes the quirky side characters stand out more. In the comic, I think it's implied that Dave has depression. He straight up says, "I'd have opened a vein if I didn't have that costume to hide inside." And he also says, "It didn't take trauma to make you wear a mask, just the perfect combination of loneliness and despair." In the movie, they changed that line to, "just the perfect combination of optimism and naivety." But I think the subtext is still there in the movie, that him being a crime fighter is his outlet to escape the monotony of everyday life. And once he becomes KickAss, he does become more confident. He even says, "I never felt so good about myself." It is genuinely compelling to see him evolve as a character through the course of the story. And I think that Aaron Taylor-Johnson does a great job at portraying all of those aspects of the character. And I also think that the concept of turning to vigilantism as a coping mechanism, or a form of escapism, is very interesting. Although maybe seeing a therapist every now and then is probably a little bit healthier than putting on a mask and getting beaten half to death every night. But I think most people who've seen the movie will agree with me when I say that the real stars of the show here are Big Daddy and Hit Girl. As much as I like KickAss as a character, there are certain times in the film where I'm like, alright, KickAss is doing his thing, sure. And then Big Daddy and Hit Girl show up and it's like, now back to the good part. So let's talk about Big Daddy, played by my boy Nicolas Cage. Nicolas Cage is fantastic in this movie. He is so good in so many ways. I love the way he plays up the goofy and nerdy side to his character.
You have anything else you'd rather spend it on? Oh my gosh. That is cool. Good at getting his ass kicked. He should call himself Ass Kick instead.
I also think that Cage completely nails the adoring father side to the character. And I think that the daddy-daughter dynamic is one of the best parts of the film. Because even though he's brought his daughter into a dangerous life, which is morally questionable, he's also a very sweet dad with a genuine love for his daughter. He takes her to get a hot fudge sundae at the bowling alley. Aww. After shooting her while wearing a bulletproof vest to get her accustomed to the feeling of being shot. And look at the excited look on his face when he's anticipating her opening her birthday present. Aww. But the present is a pair of knives. But I think if these two's performances weren't as good as they are here, it would make the situation even more uncomfortable, and I think that the great acting makes the questionable ethics more palatable. But Nick Cage also fully nails the Caped Crusader element of his character. He genuinely looks badass during the fight scenes in his costume. The movie completely changed his costume from the comic. There he was a hulking figure with his face fully covered, he had a maroon vest type thing and a leather coat, but in the movie he's basically just dressed as Batman. The film even makes a Batman comparison at one point. And speaking of Batman, I love the Adam West type voice that Nicolas Cage puts on when he's in his Big Daddy persona.
Makes it easier for us to take your word. See, we like you, but we don't trust you. I rerouted your IP address. Finding you was way too easy.
Apparently Nick Cage just started doing that voice while filming without even discussing it with anyone first. And the director Matthew Vaughn said that he was initially like, this guy can't act, what the hell is happening? And 30 seconds later he realized what Nick Cage was doing and he let him proceed. Nicolas Cage also told a story once that when he met Adam West he asked him, did you see I was channeling you in KickAss? And Adam West replied, yeah, I saw you try to channel me. But I think the voice Nick Cage does is a legitimately inspired choice. Because it would have been obvious to do the Christian Bale gravelly I'm Batman voice, but I think what he went for instead really suits the character and the tone of the film way more. I also love that Big Daddy sticks a fake mustache extension on top of his regular mustache as part of his disguise. I also like that in that same suit-up montage we see him applying eye makeup, which is something that for years the Batman movies had shied away from to the point of continuity error. For a long time the Batman films were too scared to show the Dark Knight looking like Avril Lavigne, until Robert Pattinson finally gave us what we all wanted. But let the record show that Big Daddy did it first. Apparently other actors considered for the role of Big Daddy included Brad Pitt, Mark Wahlberg, and Daniel Craig, but I know that none of them would have done half of what Nicolas Cage does here. It's definitely one where we're living in the best timeline in terms of casting. And he even gives us a little bit of a classic Cage freakout that also makes perfect sense in context.
Take cover, John! Now switch to kryptonite!
And his whole death sequence is 100 times better than it is in the comic. There is something important about his character that I need to discuss though, and that's that his origin story in the comic is completely different to how it is in the movie. Initially in the comics we're led to believe that he's an ex-cop whose wife was killed by the mob because Big Daddy wouldn't take bribes, but he escaped with his baby daughter and now he's getting revenge. But later in the comic it's revealed that Big Daddy was really just an accountant at a credit card company. His wife hated him so he ran away with their daughter and became a vigilante, and he lied to his daughter about needing to avenge her mother just to give her an exciting life. Whereas in the movie, Big Daddy's canonical backstory is basically the fake backstory from the comic. He was a hero cop who was closing in on Mark Strong's organization, so Mark Strong framed him for being a drug dealer and Big Daddy went to jail. His wife died in childbirth and 5 years later he left prison and raised his daughter as a crime fighter. And I've gotta say that I much prefer the movie version here. The main reason I don't really like the reveal from the comic is because putting your very young daughter in jeopardy as part of a revenge crusade is already pushing things in terms of ethics and morality. But stealing your infant daughter from her mother and then lying to her about her mother being dead and putting her life at stake day after day just because you want to play dress up as a superhero is awful behavior, and it throws away any likability that they'd earned with the character. So I am glad that I don't have to go through the emotional roller coaster with the Nicolas Cage version. Even the creator of the comic, Mark Millar, stated that the revelation about Big Daddy's background would not have worked in a film adaptation, and I definitely definitely agree. But you can't talk about Big Daddy without also discussing Hit Girl, or as the comic describes her, John Rambo meets Polly Pocket. Chloe Grace Moretz is so good in the role considering her young age, and apparently she did some of her own stunts. She is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most badass character in the film without question. And I think my notes sum it up when I wrote, "God damn is she cool." But I like that there's often a reminder that she's just a kid, with the way Chloe Grace Moretz plays her childish innocence and vulnerability at times. But she's also someone who shoots a guy through another guy's mouth. And it is quite the juxtaposition to see an 11-year-old girl flipping around dismembering limbs, while also wearing a purple wig and a plaid skirt, and I think that contrast is what makes her such a compelling character. The main villain in the movie is played by Mark Strong, who was in everything at the time, and Mark Strong is always reliable as an actor. I like that the character isn't a costumed evil villain, he's just a ruthless mob boss. But he's less of a kingpin type and more like Tony Soprano crossed with an 80s action villain, complete with the scene of him training in his dojo. I like the nonchalant way that he treats his violent crimes, like when he discusses what drink he'll get in the cinema while his goons are killing someone right nearby. But even though there's humorous elements to his character, I like that he's not afraid to roundhouse a little girl in the face, which shows that he's not a joke of a villain. His son in the movie is played by Christopher Mintz-Plasse, and even in 2025 it's still hard for me to not see him as McLovin at times. I don't think all of his scenes in the movie fully work, but Christopher Mintz-Plasse definitely sells some of the comedic moments. I love his face when he's jamming in the car with KickAss to CeeLo Green. And I do like his relationship with KickAss in the movie and his character's whole inner conflict, where he wants to have a friend but he also wants to emulate and impress his father. And with KickAss he has to decide between one or the other, which I found interesting. In the comic his character is a lot less nerdy. He doesn't really scream McLovin to me, he's more of a burnout. And also the comic version doesn't have that conflict where he genuinely wants to be friends with KickAss. So I think this is another time when the movie version improved upon the comic. The only characters I don't particularly like in the movie are Kick-Ass's two nerdy friends, who are nothing more than stock characters just there to spout that teenager dialogue that I've said I've outgrown. There's also a part where Evan Peters' character says that he's in love with Hit Girl even though she's like 11, which is pretty gross and I could have done without that being in the movie. There is kind of a fun novelty of having both Quicksilvers in the same movie though. So I've been hesitating saying this whole review because it sounds kind of hacky, but overall, this movie kicks ass. It's funny, it's subversive, the action is great, the characters are a lot more multifaceted than you'd expect from a movie like this, and it does what a good adaptation should do in that it took source material that was already good and improved upon it. For the most part. I will say that I liked the movie a lot more when I was 17 years old, but I was just lucky enough to watch it at the optimal age. And while I have a few nitpicks here and there, I think the entertainment factor completely overrides most of my complaints. And the cherry on top, especially for me, is that Nicolas Cage is excellent in it. This movie is a must-watch for Nicolas Cage fans and also fans of the superhero genre in general. So in 2013, a sequel to KickAss was released. I'm not going to discuss it at length because Nicolas Cage isn't in it, but there is a great frame photo of Nick Cage in a couple of scenes that I want framed on my own wall. Apparently Nick Cage was originally intended to show up in a scene where Hit Girl has a hallucination of Big Daddy. That didn't make it into the movie for whatever reason, but you can watch the storyboard version on YouTube. Kick-Ass 2 got pretty negative reviews when it first came out, but I think it's an alright film. It's a bit messy and I don't love the Hit Girl Mean Girl storyline, and the movie is not remotely anywhere near as good as the original, but I think it has its moments. There was a lot of controversy because after the Sandy Hook shooting, Jim Carrey said that he could no longer support the movie, and that got a lot of attention, but the thing is, he is great in the movie as Colonel Stars and Stripes. It's a really fun character and a fun performance from Jim Carrey, and all of his scenes are dynamite. But the problem is, he's just not in the movie that much. And in general, there's a lot of characters in the movie that I really liked, but they just don't get enough screen time. But I do like the whole community aspect of the movie, and how it builds upon where the first one left off. I think it's worth a watch, but just don't expect it to be anywhere near as good as Kick-Ass 1. So after Kick-Ass, the next thing Nicolas Cage was in was The Sorcerer's Apprentice, so until then, thanks for watching.